Good morning, everybody. And absolutely wonderful pleasure to have 197 participants in this meeting, a really important meeting, I think. It's a consultative meeting on our new sort of draft open science policy. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this platform. I want to, at the outset, really thank the ASSAf team led by Himla Subial for putting this together with, of course, the Department of Science and Innovation and USAf. And we really are very pleased to be able to have this large congregation of people to look at this first draft, if you like, of the open science policy. So today I thought it would be a good idea for me just to really introduce to you kind of two teams of people that have been involved in this. And I want to just first of all run through the list of open science, what is called the Open Science Advisory Board members. And just very quickly to run through the names. I'm not going to go through any detail about them, but the individuals in the Open Science Advisory Board are Jeten Chazli, Anwar Vahed from Derisa, Jeten Chazli is from NIPMO, Tobias Schoonbetter from UCT, Tandy Lowen from DHET, Alfred Bashishi from the Department of Telecommunications and Postal Services, Danny Adams, Dr. Danny Adams from DSI now, Gerard Puri from the Department of Trade Industry and Competition, Mapula Shangela from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, Farana Osman from the National Research Foundation, Likta Simbai from the HSRC, Himla Subial, of course, from ASSAf, and then Happy Sitole from the CSIR, and Jean-Claude Burgelman, who's from Belgium, and Jacques Ludic. So that makes up, and Segren Woodley from DSI. That makes up the advisory board. And I thought I'll just mention who they are because that's important. And then we've had a wonderful expert task team who's been very busy drafting things and putting things together and providing the advisory board with a regular kind of updates and so on. And it's a three-person expert task team. It's Professor Eagle Gledhill, who's at WITS, physicist at WITS, Adrian Tiplady from the South African Radio Astronomy Observatory, and then Nicola Mulder from UCT, who's a computational biologist. So that's the team of people. And I just want to take this opportunity also to thank Tandeka Hallis, who really kept us all together and made sure that those of us who were straying from the path were brought into line and so on. So I want to thank her really for keeping us all in check. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to say that this really is an important event today. As I indicated, there's a draft policy that's now available, and we'll be hearing about that draft policy from the expert task team, and an opportunity for discussion. What I'd like to suggest is that as we work through the expert task team input, that we hold our questions. There is a question and answer opportunity, if you like, for you to post questions, and we'll try and get to those during the session. But at the same time, I think I just want to emphasize that there's more than an hour of discussion time that will be chaired by Himla Subial, who will kind of make sure that we have the ample opportunity to discuss the big issues that are due to rise. Open science, of course, is there's an international movement towards open science. It's something that's really being taken up by governments around the world and by science systems. And in some ways, we are slightly behind the curve compared to some, but we are also ahead of the curve with other countries. Perhaps I should also just mention that there's an African Union open science platform, and that has just appointed 2 people to head up that operation. I noticed that both of them are in the meeting as well, so I look forward to their participation in this. And of course, the important thing is that the open science policy is really based on, on the fact that it was in the white paper, and then it will appear in the decadal plan. And of course, so it's important for us to really get a good handle on this. I should have mentioned that my name is Ahmed Bawa, and I'm at USAf, University South Africa. So with that, with those few words of introduction, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Danny Adams, who's at the Department of Science and Innovation, who's together with Dr. Segrin Woodley have been leading the charge on the open science policy. Over to you, Danny. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you, Prof. Ahmed Bawa, and good to see you. I don't know, I will miss happen to you now, but I mean, I'll catch up with you later on. Thank you also for the welcome and setting the scene in some way. As you indicated, my name is Daniel Adams, and I'm the Chief Director within the Department of Science and Innovation, responsible for a sub-program called Basic Sciences and Infrastructure. And infrastructure both means scientific as well as the E or cyber infrastructure, and the basic sciences, and the basic sciences actually under the leadership of Director Dr. Segrin Woodley is actually driving this initiative here. So it's also allowed me from the DSI side and for my sub-program and team to welcome such a large audience to this very important meeting. My task is just to give the purpose of the meeting. Prof. Bawa already touches on some of the aspects of this, but probably to start with now here, and just latching up to what Prof. Bawa already said now, is to say that the purpose of the meeting will be highly appreciated if we just remind ourselves of a few important things with regards to open science, and in particular, what are the drivers for open science, our particular the landscape in South Africa as a national context, as well as the regional, as well as the global landscape, and then high-level access or success factors. I'm not going to go in detail. I'm just making those are the things now. So when you look at the drivers now here, and as I said, now this will help us to appreciate the purpose of this particular meeting and orientate also our contributions to that in terms of the urgency to have this discussion. The first one is around the open access and open data policies introduced by research funders like the NIH and the Mellon Foundation, which put our South African researchers in a very difficult position now here, because they have to commit themselves to undersigning these declarations and commitments almost in a vacuum of what the national policies and regulations are within that particular grant. So that's the one, the open access and the open data policies introduced by the funders. So for them to participate in it, they have to subscribe to that. The other one is the unprecedented advances in our digital world. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, big data. Those introduce a massive amount of data, and as we have to be in that space to say, how do we deal with open access and again open data and open science within that context. Then a big contestation, is the whole issue around the scientific publications and the reward system. Big debate in terms of open access and the policies around it. And today we will articulate that probably our intentions in terms of the policy. Then the rude awakening was also through the challenges introduced by the COVID-19 pandemic that really hit us in terms of its size and its scale now, and really introduced that the urgency for us to introduce or to talk about open science and open data now, because we know if it was not for that sharing of data, that it was really that accelerated the development of vaccines and otherwise now. But then also we see a situation now where we confronted with the major challenges of the 21st century, like your SDGs, climate change, loss of biodiversity, which all of them requires massive data and analysis of that. And again, we cannot do that in a context of isolation, but rather say, how do we share data? How do we, so that we as a country can respond and contribute to the global debate in terms of solving these problems. As I said now, within the South African context, it's not completely green fields, because we have in 1819 given all these drivers and imperatives and been part of the global response now. We have started a conversation in 2018 with through a South Africa EU dialogue, developing a framework of principles and guidelines, which was a precursor for this process and this draft that we're going to discuss today now. So that policy framework was approved by our minister in 2018, which sets really the foundation and laid the foundation for, and as a precursor set for the developing of the policy framework, or the policy draft policy that we're going to discuss today. We also have the Department of Science Innovation White Paper on Science, Technology and Innovation, which again a clear articulation on the need to enter and to have clear articulation in terms of policies and guidelines and regulations around open science and open data and open access. Then, as Prof. Bauer also said, we find ourselves part of the continent and in the region. So in that regard, South Africa was also instrumental and play a critical role in participating in the development of an African open science platform, which is currently hosted by the National Research Foundation. So we're part of that, and this policy will be a key input to that and really strengthen the work of the platform. Then we also have the big data strategy of research and development and innovation, which will also draw, in terms of regulation and policy input intents, draw on this policy here, because for us, the successful implementation of this research big data strategy will be, it will be necessary to have a policy in place. Then in terms of the global movements now here, we also been following and make actually significant contributions to the development of the UNESCO recommendations around open science and on open data. Our DG was, for example, sitting on the board, and we regularly make input to that in order to shape it, that our voice and our footprint is part of the UNESCO recommendations, and we will also participate in the implementation of this. And therefore, our policy again will give us the mandate now actually to participate in the regional and global movements in order to make sure that we well align with that. So the issue now for us is really to say that for the successful implementation of this policy is that we will need to have it comes down to really a cultural shift, both in terms of our institutions that's going to drive this help us to implement the policy, and as well as the researchers. But also a key role will need to be played by our research funders. Our agencies, and I said now the custodian of this policy, but our other agencies that will contribute in terms of funding will be important in helping us to make sure that this policy is really coming to fruition and be successfully implemented. So we have the purpose of this meeting, therefore, today is then to consult in a broad context on this draft policy. However, just a word of caution here now is that when we developed the framework policy guidelines, there was very broad consultation and throughout the country with experts now here. So the word of caution that we want to put out today is that we're not going to go into the fundamental debates in that now. So that's been well articulated through that and entrenched in the policy. What we hope that we can achieve, and we encourage and appeal to our audience today and our participants, is really to look at the document in front of you now and help us to make inputs in terms of strengthening the document, clarifying in your own mind the intentions of it, and help us to really strengthen the policy intents, that they could be robust and sustainable and practically implementable. Now, so that is what we are asking now, not to help enter into a fundamental debate, but really say how we can strengthen the document in front of it now here, and also the gaps that we've been blindsided with now here, but you as experts have identified and can help us with that. So we will really want you to have, that is the mindset and the approach that we want to use in this now. So we very grateful, as Professor Bauer also said, to the task team, the expert task team spent a lot of time to get us to this point, through consulting broadly also with literature, working with literature as well as experts in the field now here. And now we want to share with you this, and we hope that today you will make constructive inputs and contributions, which will help us to achieve the workshop of this, so that we can walk away here with that assurance now here. Everybody is on board, and we can then take this policy to the next level, because the idea is that the inputs that you can receive today will be considered by the expert task team, and where possible and where necessary, the document will be adapted and changed and revised, which will then, from that point on, will then constitute a draft one, which will then again probably through a different mechanism share with the broader community in route for final approval by our minister and by our excos in the DSI. So with that, I hope that I gave you a little bit of a background, a little bit on orientation, and I said now the fundamental principle here is that we can consult. It's a consultative workshop, but not at a fundamental level, but rather considering the document in front of us and the issues I said we would like to get from you. So with that, Prof. Bauer, thank you very much for the opportunity, and again, welcome everybody on board.
Thank you so much, Danny, and that's and I just want to really take this opportunity also of just thanking you for your role and the role of Dr. Fagan Woodley in bringing this to the point that it is. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to hand over to the expert task team, to Dr. Adrian Toplady, Professor Igor Gledhill, and Professor Nicola Mulder. And Adrian, I think I'm just going to leave it to you to manage the hour. Is that okay?
Sure, that's absolutely fine.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Sure, great. Thank you very much. And we certainly, as an expert task team, I think, have been looking forward to this stage of the process and to have the broader consultation. I think it's absolutely been a critical and necessary part of this process. And let me just hopefully share my screen here, so hopefully everyone should be able to see it. And our general approach, has been really to consider and review all of the inputs that have come out of various processes, looking at the SAEU dialogue framework, in which it provided a range of open science recommendations, as well as international declarations and policies, international best practice. And our aim as the expert task team was really to try to synthesize the many hundreds of pages of documentation that is available on this matter, as well as the outputs of the various processes already undertaken, and try to synthesize it down into a policy that is sustainable in the long term, that provides clear strategic direction and guidance in ensuring that we're able to establish an open science ecosystem within South Africa. So we prepared a draft, or should I say we prepared a revision which we've consulted with the Open Science Advisory Board, and now we're at this stage here. It's not really a second draft, we probably still at draft 0, Not to say that we don't have multiple revisions of this draft on our various laptops, and I think we've gone through about 20 revisions so far. The general structure of the open science policy, I've set it out there. Hopefully you've all had an opportunity to scan, if not read in detail, the policy draft document that has been made available to you. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to touch on a few of the substantive issues that are not directly dealt with in terms of the policy intent. And the first being the guiding principles. I think it's important to ensure that there are guiding principles that will inform the implementation of the open science system within South Africa. And the first three guiding principles there really speak to, and are internationally informed in terms of best practice, really speak to the underlying principles of how the open science system should operate, based on guiding principles of fair, care, and trust. I'm not going to bother reading out the various definitions there. If I were to do so, this would extend the stakeholder engagement quite substantially. But I think the three principles at the bottom are equally as important and really inform how the open science system should be implemented. It should be implemented with a flexible approach that is context driven within South Africa. And it should implement a principle of sustainability. We need to ensure that the decisions we make now in respect of long-term practices, services, infrastructures, and funding models are sustainable in the medium and long-term future. And perhaps one of the most important guiding principles that underpins much of the open science system, both locally and internationally, is the concept of as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And what this really speaks to is that particularly research output should be open and consistent with the objectives of open science, unless there are statutory, ethical, intellectual property, contractual, commercial, environmental, or research credibility considerations that would result in untenable risk to the key research subjects or stakeholders. And I think this is quite a critical principle and a real understanding of what this means amongst the community will facilitate a much more efficient and understandable implementation of the open science in South Africa. Just going to... The next substantive issue really deals with the open science definition. And there's a range of open science definitions that could be adopted, which have been declared across various international policies. And in considering all of these, we define open science within the South African context to be enabling access, utilization, and sharing of publicly funded research outputs and data to all levels of society. That being said, we recognize that open science can be cut in a number of different ways. And when you're undertaking a broad scope in respect of a system-wide implementation of open science, you'll start to see various facets of open science arising and becoming visible and having extensive impact on the science and innovation system. And so we thought it useful to actually recognize that the term open can be applied to each of these facets of a science system, either separately or both separately and independently. And we consider it useful to perhaps define the term open when applied within this context of the open science system to mean the following, and I'll read it there: to establish the necessary transparency and non-proprietary in order to support an open science system. For example, and there are a range of these different facets that have arisen, things such as open big data, open government data, open source, open notebooks, open methods, etc. And if you actually go through, there's a really interesting breakdown of what open science could potentially encompass. And going through all of this, I think this is really quite an important definition to adopt within the policy. Now, move forward. The third substantive issue is to be dealt with here is regarding monitoring and evaluation. What the policy is quite clear about is proposing the establishment of the South African Open Science Observatory. And this plays a very critical role in not only monitoring and evaluating the implementation of the open science within South Africa, but as well as monitoring the outcomes and the outputs of the open science system. So it's there to provide for online tools for stakeholders to monitor and evaluate the implementation of open science as well as the outcomes. And the scope of online tools should provide, there will be a meaningful dashboard of indicators, analytics, and visualizations, really to help in promoting good practice, and also inform a wide variety of stakeholders of the status of open science within South Africa, strengths and weaknesses of the open science system, and also to provide effective oversight through appropriate quantitative and qualitative metrics and tools. And this monitoring and evaluation approach should, of course, be informed by international best practice, and it should address, amongst other things, the delivery of the open science system against those key identified outcomes: open access, open data, open source, open resources, open methods, and open review. It's also important to recognize that the effectiveness of the open science system is critically dependent on the research community and the participants within the open science system. And we envisage that certainly a hybrid model of evaluation may be required that accounts for both traditional measures of academic output, as well as those that reflect on participation of relevant researchers within the open science system. And it's likely that this will need to exist on timescales that are required certainly for the broader research community to adopt an open science practice. And really, it could potentially be discipline specific, because in large part, the community of practice within research disciplines may be driven by the global research community as opposed to local. And so we advise that organizations undertaking evaluation should develop and adopt appropriate evaluation systems that account for the breadth of missions within the research enterprise, whilst not unreasonably disadvantaging individual researchers within their community of practice. And I think the last part of this before I hand over to my colleagues is critical success factors, and we felt it important to include the critical success factors in this policy because these are almost necessary conditions to ensure a successful implementation of open science within South Africa. And going through this list, of course, there's a need for universal access, and this really speaks to district and local internet coverage that should be improved, whilst providing for online training for citizens participating in citizen science, for example, is absolutely critical. There needs to be trusted security for data repositories. The absence of such security almost makes a gift of South African research to malicious actors. Cognizance of publishing realities, which could very well be discipline specific. I guess the implementation of the National Open Science Policy shouldn't, in its enthusiasm, kill the goose that lays the golden eggs by penalizing disciplines that are nevertheless making an impact. And so in some cases, which are discipline specific, timescales for implementation could be informed by both the local and global community, as I mentioned earlier. Legislation, of course, there's a number of policy and regulatory linkages that one would need to consider, particularly in respect of open science and intellectual property rights. Again, speaking to that underlying fundamental principle of as open as possible, as closed as necessary. Sustainability, I won't go through each of those, but it stands to reason, of course, that open science needs to be sustainable in the sense that it's able to be maintained for an extended time, as well as being defensible and legitimate for all of its stakeholders. In order to be seen as being legitimate, one needs to ensure appropriate stakeholder engagement. A research community that sees the open science project as legitimate with a value proposition that benefits the entire research enterprise. Change management, we're going to go through a substantial transitionary phase, and it's important that an appropriate change management plan is developed, engaged on, that iterative testing and designing of an implementation plan is undertaken before it is considered to be accepted. So all these kind of factors as part of the general change management process is extremely important to ensure successful implementation. Global compatibility, it stands to reason, of course, that we are part of not only a South African and African-wide research enterprise, but we are part of a global research enterprise. And it's important to ensure that whatever open science system we implement within South Africa, it is compatible with that of the global community. And finally, consistent interdepartmental policy. And this is really is a critical success factor to ensure the ability to implement consistent policy across all government departments. And without that, and without having the government departments speaking to each other from the same page, it will incur significant challenges and hurdles in implementing this open science policy. So I'm going to stop there for now. I won't deal with the policy intents, and I'll hand over, I think, to Eagle, who will take us through the first two policy intents, or three or four, sorry, related to policy and regulatory changes, open access, education and skills, and copyright and intellectual property. Igor, you had indicated that you had connectivity challenges, but I see your presentation there and I see your video working. So you've obviously sorted them out, so over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to thank the University of Fort Hare for hosting me while I'm in the Amatola Mountains. I think one of the success factors is universal access and persistent, stable broadband for HDIs and also households and businesses. So I'll turn off my video now, I think. And there we go. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about these. I'm going to cover three paragraphs in the draft policy. One on policy and regulatory changes, one on open access, and one on education and skills. So policy linkages really link people and hopefully make it easy for researchers and readers and businesses, private sector, everyone, in fact, citizen scientists, to access and contribute to science. So the importance of the communities and practice and stakeholder meetings like this one is enormous. To tackle, first of all, IP community of practice. If this works, then open science will really enhance the work of the NSI. Just like to give some of the background documents, although Dr. Adams has already done so. In the African context, Agenda 2063, CISA 2024, and the African Open Science Platform, of course, all the way through to the South African Decadal Plan, open access policies all the way through. The scholarly publishing program at ASSAf. Then it's important to think of the science engagement strategy, which was very helpful in the background to this policy, and the Ministerial Task Team report on Black academics. We are signatories to the various open access statements, including the Sao Paulo statement, and this has been helped by the EU-SA dialogue. And you will find there's a preliminary list of legislation in the appendix to the actual document. Tackling IPR, the IPR Act talks about intellectual property emanating from publicly financed research and development, which should be identified, protected, utilized, and commercialized for the benefit of South Africa. Data does fall within the scope. There is a NIPMO note, which is very useful. Declaration to the NIPMO office is important. And there are two needs from the policy side here. One is speed, and the other is an open science-friendly environment. I understand that the IPR Act is under revision. Thank you very much, NIPMO, for the invitation to talk there. Relevant in the environment is copyright. The Act of 1978 is also under revision and consideration. In the last version that I saw, it does remedy the gaps in the bill remedies the gaps in the existing Act about the digital space. And it essentially does make provisions for open access, open science in general, and open educational resources, and specific revisions for persons with disabilities and the digitization and preservation of collections. There is controversy over fair use. There is a revision in the current bill. I know Adrian's already tackled as open as possible, as closed as necessary, and he's run through this statement. If you would like, I will come back to the fine print, which I have reproduced here, just noting that there is a big concern with human rights, the right to privacy, protection of Indigenous knowledge, protection of vulnerable populations. IPR, contractual agreements under the company law of South Africa, endangered species, and compromise of scientific credibility, because open access has opened up some predatory practices. So this principle is essential. It enables appropriate licensing conditions for project-specific outputs. And of course, there is balance to be found, and this policy encourages this balance to be thought about. As early as possible. Respect of international law and treaties. To come to open access itself, a very simple definition has been chosen. Open knowledge, as defined by the new UNESCO recommendations of November 2021, is a long definition. But open access here is defined as a set of principles and a range of practices through which research outputs, and we might be encouraged to define this as literature and publications, are distributed online free of cost or other access barriers. South Africa is seeing unsustainable cost escalations, and of course, a great number of shocks to the national fiscus, including that of the pandemic. And these create barriers to readership and publication. There is a substantial amount of funding involved in enabling subscriptions and article processing charges. So this policy should provide a vehicle for access to, and especially democratization of knowledge, a new paradigm available to the NSI, an enabling environment across all researchers, institutions, and companies, and that includes citizen scientists, regardless of race, gender, and geographic location. We know from the work of people involved that women have been disadvantaged during the pandemic, and working from home requires research access for everybody. And that can drive scientific progress with faster routes to impact and foster innovation for inclusive development. I'd like to stress that commercialization is not the only route to impact. There are other routes, including policy, action, direct action, and for example, the enabling of vaccines. the open science that has been used in that respect. Paragraph 1 under open access stresses as open as possible, as closed as necessary, and the requirements of co-funding, including international funders. It shall be mandatory for publications arising from publicly funded research, but desirable for research from all sources of funding, and that includes citizen science. And the decision on whether to publish through open access channels should come after the decision on whether to seek protection of intellectual property. That is why we are requesting really smooth, really easy processes that are understood with great facility by researchers. So there can be discipline-specific publication requirements, and we have stated that open access should not materially affect perceived credibility. Where possible, copyright should be retained by authors. License to share and reuse with attribution to the original authors should be provided based on machine-readable standardized licenses. We haven't specified which licenses because this must be a flexible policy. Second one is possibly one of the most important recommendations. A national forum shall be established for the promotion and development of best practice, which will change as we go into the future, for the fostering of open access and the support of research culture change. There is actually a profound research culture change needed, particularly in view of the current incentive schemes. This forum can facilitate ongoing dialogue with all the stakeholders, and we don't even know who all the stakeholders will be, to consider the diversity of the South African scholarly community. There should be a code of conduct approved by the OSAB. It could be incorporated into other codes of conduct, or it could be referred to by other codes of conduct. And the reason for this is that research integrity is important and predatory behavior must be guarded against. And of course, the incentive schemes, it makes a great deal of sense to change incentive schemes so that open access publication can be encouraged and recognized. I'll now come to education and skills. Now, the little picture that I've put there is supposed to indicate the joy of discovery, but this section deals rather with the education of those involved in open access and open science as a whole, open data included, and all aspects of open knowledge, rather than open education. Although we have included open education here, but this is a very general section. So the most important fact here is that because this is a cultural and a behavioral phenomenon and a new approach to research development and innovation, that we really need to ensure public understanding. And there's a great deal of awareness to be built and a great deal of capacity in dealing with this world and the creation of the new learning culture that's really needed. Point 1 in this section is the human resource development strategy. A framework is needed. I know that there is quite a good framework that's available, or at least being developed through the African Open Science Platform for open science practitioner training. And very much the promotion of using regional and international collaboration on training and engagement. For example, CoData, part of the International Science Council, is very much involved in training in South Africa and has been for a very long time. So has ASSAf, so is the African Open Science Platform. And this must be informed by consultation with research leaders and stakeholders. If these systems don't work, one needs to know as fast as possible and fix them. And this covers everyone involved in the libraries and IT systems. I'm not going to read through this, it will be available. Open data and open access specialists, including NREN specialists and those who make available the information that's needed. Monitoring and evaluation and especially managers of research infrastructure and data governance. The objectives of the HRD strategy are the learning culture, equitable HRD, education, training and engagement, enabling the resourcing and development of e-learning platforms, and best practice that is codified and adopted within the scholarly publishing industry, for whom this has enormous impact, especially either in terms of how costs are recovered in the publishing industry or how barriers to access or publishing are thrown up. Then alignment across the funding agencies, the qualifications required in government departments, sufficient resources of public entities, resourcing of public entities, the adoption of open science and citizen science within the basic education curriculum, which is where interest and engagement with science really starts. I recently had a chat with a 9-year-old who was full of the joy of discovery, which often gets beaten out of one later in one's education. And the promotion of innovative approaches for open science at different stages of the scientific process. Open lab notebooks come in here. The third point is the open science communication strategy, enormously important. It must be both ways. Communication isn't communication if it isn't both ways. Awareness and training, business and industry, as well as the traditional stakeholder groups. International and multi-stakeholder cooperation is absolutely essential, and there has been real progress there recently. So thank you very much. The field is moving fast. UNESCO recently adopted a very good recommendation, which is not only applicable to publicly funded open science. There's a new OEC toolkit, and I have a couple of extra slides available on what kinds of open science are there. And I would simply like to say that diamond, platinum open science has no cost barriers at all, no article processing charges, and no subscription charges. Thank you. That's where I'll finish off. Thank you.
Thanks, Igor. So I will continue now with the next section. So I'll be talking about two sections of the policy. This is the first of all, the rewards and incentives, and then I'll talk about the citizen science side of things. So we all know that open science is there are a lot of barriers to open science. I mean, you need to have a reason to, we all know it's really important to have open science, but you need to have some sort of encouragement for researchers and institutions to adopt open science and to obviously, buy into this policy. So one of the changes that happened fairly recently in terms of open access and recognition of research outputs is the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessments, or the DORA as it's known. And this redefines the way that people measure the quality and impact of research outputs. And so there you're not allowed to technically look at impact factors anymore of journals. You're supposed to look at the quality of the science. And in some fields, like in mine, it actually ends up promoting the use of open access journals because as I say, I mean, this doesn't apply across all fields and it's not mutually exclusive, but in our field, a lot of the high impact journals, those journals that have got really large impact factors, tend to be closed access. And so this then obviously, discourages people from publishing in these open access journals. So I think that's an important change that has happened. So this is just some of the background in terms of rewards and incentives. So we need to make sure that we have rewards and incentives in place for both researchers and then also those that facilitate open science. So this would be the funders, the policymakers, etc. And so there are several recommendations that we've put forward in the policy. The first is to facilitate the assignment of digital object identifiers to resources other than just publications. And this is to ensure that you can cite things. So if you want to be recognized for data sets, for other research outputs or other kinds of open science materials, they need to be citable because then you can measure how much they used. And so if we have DOIs available, or a way to assign DOIs to these different open science outputs, then we can enable this. The next thing is to have ensure that the monitoring or the recognition methods, so how the NRF evaluates researchers or how the university evaluates researchers, we need to make sure that these consider the open science activities. So in that we should consider reports on open science activities, at both the researcher, institutional and departmental level when they're assessing each of those different groups. We need to make sure that there is inclusion of open access, open data and open material citations in the list of things that you report on when you get measured for your outputs, and also the inclusion of alternative channels for publication of research outputs. And we also then recommend that the agencies that are responsible for recognition should recognize and reward researchers that have successfully adopted and implemented all these principles in this particular open science policy. And so some examples of this include researchers that share data and obviously other resources and quantify the reuse of the data, and obviously citations would help with that. Institutions and researchers that demonstrate open science activities. So this could be the sharing of data, the promotion of reuse of their resources, or any other kinds of open science activities. And there must be some way to report and recognize this. Also, the level of openness of science as a measure by publication in open access journals, open datasets, open software, and other open materials. And then collaborative research. So, big collaborative research projects with big data, multidisciplinary research these days, a lot of, certainly in my field, a lot of publications tend to have, huge author lists because you have big collaborations. And in the past, this was not really recognized. Your contribution to that was not necessarily recognized. So there should be mechanisms to be able to describe what your role was in a big national or international collaboration, because these are really important in promoting open science as well. And then it's also important one of the recommendations is to ensure appropriate funding and support for data curation and submission to public repositories. So one of the barriers to open science and putting data and materials out there is this FAIR concept of making them findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. You actually need a bit of effort. It takes a bit of effort to make your resources fair. So people need to be able to curate the resources, find the right repository, do the submission, make sure these resources are actually findable. Otherwise, there's no point in them being open. And this requires specific skills. So you need to be able to include budgetary items in research funding that cover the data curation or the data stewardship or the data management and submission to some sort of open repository. We need training and skills development in these sorts of areas of data stewardship, and then promotion of development of careers in data curation. There isn't a big opportunity at the moment, apart from in the libraries, for careers in data curation. And then ideally also, this is not in the policy, but I think it's also important to recognize and actually create funding for research that reuses existing data. So a lot of the international funding agencies are starting to put out calls for proposals where you don't generate new data, you use existing data and you answer new research questions of that data. So that is the rewards and incentives. And obviously it's an important aspect to encourage people to adopt this open science policy. So the second component that I'm going to be touching on from the policy is the citizen science. So citizen science relates to the active participations of public, of the general public in scientific research. So that the general public can contribute to data collection, monitoring, analysis, etc., towards a common goal in a particular research project, and it's usually driven by a professional scientist. It's important to recognize the contributions, the scientific contributions, and the opportunities that arise from this. There's potential for innovation, there's potential for advancing science. But one of the considerations in citizen science is that whereas in an institution where scientists are sitting in a university, they're governed by a code of conduct of that university. They're governed by ethics boards or ethics committees at that university, whereas the general public doesn't have that oversight. So it's important to make sure that is in place for citizen science. And so globally, there's the Citizen Science Global Partnership that has been established, and many different countries have signed up to that or joined this. And their aim is to see how citizen scientists can contribute to furthering the Sustainable Development Goals. And another important sort of aspect of recognition of citizen science is that SACNASP has released a formal statement on citizen science, recognizing the importance of citizens and the general public in contributing to science and furthering knowledge. So citizen scientists can't, sign up as a professional, but they can be linked to a professional scientist who is a member of SACNASP. So the specific recommendations with respect to citizen science include the establishment of an independent Center for Citizen Science. And this basically provides an umbrella organization whose mandate includes funding and promotion of research collaboration between the professional scientists and then the general public who want to get involved in science, fostering collaborations between science, society, and industry. So you want to promote innovation here. And the center should then sort of set up guidelines of how citizens can get involved. Embed open science in society, so encourage the groups to get together and actually respond to major societal and economic challenges. So identify where there are challenges or science-related objectives that the general public can get involved in and contribute to, and provide access to information. So this open data for the community members to actually come in and answer and solve real-world questions. And then finally, the additional citizen science recommendations include putting in place some mechanisms for ethical oversight of citizen science. So, for example, in addition to having the center that sort of oversees the citizen science activities, there should be a requirement that citizen scientists actually work under the supervision of a professional scientist who is then under ethical kind of oversight at the institution. We want to ensure that citizen science potentially gets included within the basic education curriculum. Not many people know what citizen science is and how they can get involved. And then actually develop a mechanism to measure the contribution and impact. So, while we're trying to promote it now, it'd be really good to see what is the impact that citizen scientists make on the South African economy and the biotechnology, on the other scientific outputs, and potentially then if we identify that this is has a reasonably high impact, then potentially in the future ring fence some percentage of publicly funded budget to projects that specifically have a citizen science component. So those are several ways in which we have to get citizen scientists involved and how open science can promote that. So I'll hand you back now to Adrian.
Thanks, Nicola. Right, so I'm just going to wait a sec. I just want to check if it, sorry, apologies. So I'm going to do the last two policy intents and hopefully should be able to finish on time according to the agenda. The first policy intent concerns open data, and it generally refers to data that can be freely accessed, used and shared, subject to most of the requirements that ensure the preservation of provenance and openness in respect to the data. And we recognize that benefit can actually be realized through four key areas. There's the research enterprise where open data can be utilized in unpredictable ways, economic growth through various open innovation services and business models, which are based on ease of access to information, content, knowledge, and realization of data equity in this kind of big data world. Performance and efficiency of the public service, recognizing that there is enhanced efficiency of public services as a result of cross-sector sharing of data and evidence-based strategic decision support. And finally, benefit in social welfare and public perception of transparency due to enhanced collaboration, participation, and social innovation as a result of greater transparency and access to information. And we also recognize in the policy that this full benefit across those 4 key areas is actually captured if government departments participate within the open science framework, as much as universities and research organizations within South Africa. There's a huge amount of data that is being generated, which is directly funded by various government departments. And that data can be utilized across many interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral research initiatives in South Africa. Of course, integration into a fair framework is absolutely critical to ensure full exploitation of open data. We also recognize, data curation is extremely critical and important. And what data curation is about is separate from stewardship, is about managing and organizing data to derive added value. And this must be the ultimate goal. But recognizing that to suddenly start curating or derive data from publicly funded research in South Africa is going to be a substantial step. And so what we've done is we've included an appropriate descriptor, valuable, within the policy, which can be defined through and is intended to be defined through appropriate standards, such that there can actually be a ramp up in terms of curatorship of data, of research output from publicly funded research, to enable a ramping up of resources and competencies. And so there's a focus, and specifically the policy focuses in respect of open data, focuses on valuable publicly funded research data. And it's intended that the appropriate standards will be defined, and these will be updated as the open science system is implemented over medium to long term within South Africa. And so the key policy intents or recommendations is firstly a requirement for data management plans, which implement the necessary open science standards for all approved publicly funded research. And these plans should be budgeted for as part of the applications for budget. And those plans should speak to things about how the data is going to be integrated into the FAIR framework and made accessible within an open science ecosystem. The second major policy recommendation is the establishment or identification of a national agency which is appropriately resourced to designate public entities to serve as curators and stewards of data, serve as long-term curators and stewards for data not already curated by designated public entities, serve as an oversight agency for designated public entities to facilitate and should facilitate common access to open data, will serve as a primary archiving function for data not hosted elsewhere within the boundaries of South Africa, or a full mirroring function where such data is hosted by other public entities. Should advise the DSI of relevant standards and also develop appropriate tools to facilitate access to open data repositories. And this is an absolutely critical component of ensuring the success of open data within an open science system, is development of those tools to enable open access, to enable access to open data. So the second policy intent deals with research data infrastructure, and this is of course critical and forms really a backbone to ensuring the realization of data equity within the vast amounts of data being generated on an ongoing basis in our big data world. And as I mentioned, provision of this data really provides a backbone for the open science system, and it provides a means of enabling collaborative, multidisciplinary and data-intensive research, which is almost a third pillar of the research enterprise alongside theory and experiment. And ensuring, we need to be able to ensure removal of barriers to entry, which is critical to be able to maximize and broaden the scope of socioeconomic benefit arising from the research endeavor. And the funding and planning must be based on sustainability, a not-for-profit long-term vision with long-term practices, services, infrastructures and funding models on a robust federated basis, with responsibility held by the scientific community for custodianship. And the key policy recommendations look at the establishment of this a federated open science infrastructure for research outputs. NICI's is identified as being the implementation entity for coordinating development of such a plan for the establishment of this federated open science infrastructure. Standards and policy recommendations to create an enabling environment for open science, exhibiting characteristics of interoperability and enabling simple and open sharing of data and metadata between systems, disciplines, and research collaborators. And those would be developed through the Open Science Advisory Board and approved by the DSI. DSI should also ensure that there's sufficient funding to enable adequate availability, accessibility, and usability of data infrastructure for research outputs. And that funding should also include provision of the relevant technical support, tools, and software. Those barriers to entry is not just about access to the research infrastructure, but it's also being able to use the research data infrastructure and be able to maximize the opportunities presented within the various data repositories that exist. Development of data management plans to ensure long-term data curation and stewardship of hosted data, and that's all development by the research data infrastructures. Of course, recognizing that connectivity is a critical success factor, and I identified it in one of my earlier slides that speaks to critical success factors of implementation of open science in South Africa. And we need to really recognize that there's a disparity. We need to ensure we reduce and mitigate the disparity in access across institutions, particularly HDRs. And this must be actively addressed. And there are various other national policies that address broadband connectivity across South Africa. And we really need to ensure that these initiatives is enhanced through this policy, focusing on key factors relating to reliable and freely accessible broadband internet connectivity at publicly funded research performing organizations, safety of researchers, particularly women utilizing research facilities and resources, and ensuring reliable and low-cost broadband interconnectivity for researchers, students, and citizen scientists that are undertaking research temporarily or permanently at home. And I think this is also reflecting the new way of work that has arisen from the COVID pandemic, and looking at how research may be undertaken in the future, recognizing that we need to ensure an enabling environment for researchers to undertake research endeavors, both at research performing organizations and institutions, as well as at home. And I think that ends the suite of presentations made by the expert task team. And I think I'll hand over to Prof. Sudio, Prof. Boa, who may hand over to Prof. Sudio to lead us in the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Adrian and Eagle and Nicola. Thank you so much for that. And as our participants will see, there's a really huge amount of work done by a small expert task team who've really engaged with the big ideas from all over the world, and I think that there's a lot to be discussed and so on. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Professor Himla Sudyal. She's a human geneticist and is currently the CEO of ASSAf, the Academy of Science of South Africa. And she's going to moderate the discussion period. And I hopefully Adrian, Nicola, and Eagle will be on call to take most of the questions. So, and I think that we should see this not just as a question and answer session, but also as an opportunity for inputs, if you like, that can contribute to the discussion further. Thank you so much. Himla, over to you.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you to Adrian, Eagle, and Nicola for once again very clearly communicating what is in the draft policy framework. As you've heard, this is quite a challenge to take on, because whether we like it or not, this is the way of the future. And given that it's a future with many unknowns, these colleagues have taken into account from broad reading based on international best practice what should be recommended for the policy brief for us in South Africa. So thanks again for putting that into perspective. Colleagues, please use the Q&A to post any questions or comments. We've closed the chat because people have been complaining that writing in the chat box was quite distracting during the presentations. And I guess one way of circumventing that is to leave the chat box open so that it fills on the side and doesn't overlay on the presentations. So colleagues, I'm going to go through to what is in the Q&A session for now and give others an opportunity to think about what they would like to put to the panel so that they could come in and answer or provide some insights into the areas you wish to have a bit more explanations for. So one of the questions comes from Robin Crew, and he asks, to what extent is this policy going to be coercive in relation to the hybrid model of evaluations? Another question is this restrictive of freedom of inquiry? So I'll add the next question. We go back to the incentive slides we just saw later on. Can I ask for more details? This is a question from Nina Lewin. Dale Peters asks, and this question is to Adrian, could you clarify the governance structure envisaged in the open science policy and the respective roles of the bodies mentioned? For example, the Open Science Advisory Board, the Open Science Observatory, and the National Forum. I'll take those three questions first and ask our panelists to try to address them as is applicable. So to what extent is this policy going to be coercive in relation to the hybrid model of evaluation?
I'll take a stab at answering that, but invite my colleagues to also provide input. I think the policy is not restrictive in that sense, in that it doesn't direct the manner in which the hybrid model, what the hybrid model would look like, other than simply saying that it needs to be able to recognize both the traditional evaluation of the traditional research enterprise in respect of academic outputs and how that's considered, as well as researchers that are participating with an open science system. I don't think it should necessarily be overly coercive, but recognizing the fact that evaluation systems is effectively a critical lever for moving us towards an open science system. And so we need to be very careful in how that model is developed and designed and implemented. We're reasonably silent on that in the policy without just giving some high-level principles of what it needs to consider. But I think that development of that evaluation model and framework would need to go through quite an iterative process of stakeholder engagements and consultation to find an appropriate balance. You know, also recognizing, for example, we do identify the fact that in many cases it's discipline specific, and the research practice within various disciplines may differ, and you may find a movement towards open science being facilitated a lot more quickly because of global practice than other disciplines. And I think which is why the hybrid model needs to be able to recognize that and not specifically disadvantage a specific discipline simply because of how the global community of practice within research publications and research endeavor are dictated. So I do think it needs to be quite flexible, certainly during the transition period. And I think this process could very well take 5 or 10 years before there's been a true migration globally to an open science ecosystem. And we need to be able to recognize that, and we shouldn't just kill the goose and lay the golden egg. That was the comment that was made earlier. I think that's extremely pertinent in this discussion.
Thanks.
Not sure if any of the other task team members want to respond further.
No. Eagle, I see your hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Perhaps I can address a couple of questions, and Himla, please stop if I'm running on. In terms of whether this is a coercive, I think that open science does not work like that. In fact, if one behavior is
Eagle, you are quite distorted. I guess your bandwidth is problematic. Do you want to possibly try and answer that in the response to type an answer? I'm sorry, we just couldn't hear you. While Eagle attempts to do that, Nicola, are you still with us? Yes, you are. Could you perhaps add a little bit more details with respect to the incentives question?
Yes, I see later that you mentioned it specifically related to DORA. So I don't know if you want to try and say exactly what the question was. You said you needed some more details. Was it about DORA or was it about the incentives themselves?
It just said the last slide.
No, I said go back to the slides later. The last slide was on citizen science. But let me put those slides up and then we can see. Let me just see if she's clarified the question. The incentives slide, yes, but which one? There are several.
I'm sorry, it doesn't say, and where's that question disappeared from my screen? Anyway.
It's been moved to the answered box.
Oh.
Yeah. Perhaps if Nina could
ask
maybe ask a specific question about any specific aspect on the slides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so we can maybe move on to the next question. And
I suppose in the framework structure, this is the thought process behind it. And as Adrian says, a lot of this is still a work in progress, and that is going to take some more discussions. And, when you talked about the structure for the open science, there's a few recommendations as to what the plan would like to have in place. And I'm sure some of these issues will be taken back there. So if Nina wants to be more specific, please go ahead and try to add to that question to guide a favorable response. Eagle, I see your hand. Let's see if we can get you back on.
Thank you. I think that in terms of incentive schemes, and in fact everything that's done, it's important for the Open Science Advisory Board and its structures to pilot test schemes, to go through design cycles, to observe and listen up and react That is the way that open science ought to work. It's not going to be the same into the future as it is now. I have a couple of other comments. Certainly, indeed. Then Colleen asked about what does it mean on the ground as students. My view on that would be that for her students, there may be benefits in publishing openly and publishing data, and that the students should think about it really early in the project. Is this project designed to patent things? Is it designed to produce IP? Does it need to have declaration? Or is it designed for publication of data, and for open access? May I go on a little, Himmler? Vanessa asked what level of consultation has been undertaken with private industry. Yep, Himmler?
Yes, no, go for it. I'm just making a note of which questions
Okay.
you're addressing so that I don't repeat it.
Right. Vanessa McBride asked about the consultation undertaken with private industry. The ETT, the expert task team, hasn't consulted a great deal with private industry and would love to have comment on this document. I think I can also address a comment by Denise Nicholson on the copyright amendment. The answer here is that the copyright amendment bill has to take this kind of development into account, and it has been in discussion for so long that South Africa is becoming opened up to exploitation by other countries. We really need this bill to protect fair use and or fair and be clear on modern digital protection. I believe the issues need to be addressed urgently in this bill. Then I think there's a comment from John Sturley from Elsevier. Implementation is the next phase, certainly seen as a transitional phase and at a national level. So the dialogue with publishers is extremely important. That's not a very good answer, John, but I think that's where we are at the moment. Can I also take up Samuel Simango on the PIA, Promotion of Access to Information Act? Yes, it is relevant. In a policy, we had to be fairly brief. So we policies and regulations that were in the index. I think that comes up at the implementation level. And then I should stop there and hand back to you, Himmler.
Thanks, Igor. And thanks for diligently going through the Q&A and addressing the ones where you could, address, so it'll save me some time. If I go back to the beginning, Adrian, there was a question from Dale Peasters concerning the governance structure that was envisaged. You want to
sure,
take a shot at that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And just to add to what Igor was saying, I think the difficulty in developing the policy is what we're trying to do is creating an enabling framework for open science to work. And so many of the implementation details, is not to say that we haven't given thought to things such as the evaluation framework, things such as all of the various other nitty-gritty details around training, for example. It's not as if we haven't given thought to that. It's just that we want to create an enabling framework that enables the Open Science Advisory Board to apply its mind to each of these measures and plans that need to be developed and implemented, and allow for that iterative prototyping of the various kind of strategies and plans that would need to be developed, as Igor mentioned. I think we don't want to start specifying exactly to the details, how everything should work. Otherwise, we're going to be sitting in an engagement process for many years and actually not get on with developing and implementing and establishing open science ecosystem. So in terms of the governance structure, ultimately, the DSI will establish formally an Open Science Advisory Board. And that board, in some cases will advise standards or policies or frameworks, etc., to be approved by the DSI, or in certain circumstances is responsible for approving certain standards or policies. It will see the establishment, and it will approve the establishment of the Open Science Observatory, as well as, I guess, the national forum as well. I think the policy is a bit mute on that, but the intention is really that the Open Science Advisory Board is providing an oversight mechanism for the DSI. And so all of the other relevant structures would fall beneath the Open Science Advisory Board. If there's an alternative structure that is required to engage directly with the DSI, then that would be considered in due course by the DSI and established outside, not within or outside the scope of the policy in terms of where the governance currently sits at the moment. But ultimately, at this point in time, it's envisaged that the Open Science Advisory Board would be the key oversight mechanism. And where it hasn't been empowered to approve the establishment of certain fora in terms of the policy, that would ultimately be approved by the DSI.
Thanks, Adrian. You're quite right. All of this, the kind of steps to follow on in the advancement of this framework is going to take some other work, and that is why inputs and comments from participants during a forum of this nature is going to be useful at driving those sorts of processes. Yeah.
And I imagine there needs to be continuous engagement. Even the monitoring and evaluation framework, which still needs to be approved by USAf, would need to be developed and engaged with the community.
Yeah. No, that's so true. In keeping with some of the problem areas, Nikki, if you could just look at the question by Yusuf Motara as well, with respect to judging the impact of open science is quite difficult, as he adds, in terms of rewards and incentives. And his concern is that unless it is well defined at a national level, there will be fragmentation of incentive systems within institutions that can easily lead to gaming the system rather than pushing forward the principles of open science. What's your thought to that comment? And while you have the floor, Nina Lewin has added that she'd like some more feedback on the DORA and management of matrix from the slide you presented. So over to you, Nicola.
Thanks for this question. So in terms of the judging of open science, so there are two aspects. One is to report on your open science activities, and then downstream, obviously, there's the impact of that open science. And the open science policies in Europe have also only recently been adopted, so we can learn from how they're doing it. And this is not a solved problem as to how you measure the actual impact. But we can, reviewed grant proposals that are looking at open science, and I've seen many ways to actually report metrics on your open science, so on your open science activities. So how many data sets you have out there, how many open access publications you have, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we need to separate the reporting of your open science outputs and activities, and then downstream we can then start to think about metrics for measuring the impact of those. you're right, it's not going to be simple, and you know, there will always be ways to sort of you know, trick the system, but you know, it does rely on, you know, measuring the impact does rely on the recognition by other people. So if somebody else uses your publication or your data set, it relies on them to give the appropriate citation and acknowledgement. And so that's the only way, you know, is to have the, you know, the integrity in the scientific community to be able to do that, and to not trick the system. So you know, I think the actual implementation, the actual metrics, and how each of these will be reported and measured, these will come into the implementation side of things. So these are not outlined in the policy itself. So we will learn from different, how different communities have done it. So if you say the community engagement group have been, you know, have some expertise in this, or have tried things out, I think in the implementation side, we will learn from you know, what other communities and also how it's been done in the European open science policy and how that's been implemented. So yes, I recognize that there are many challenges ahead, and this is just the beginning, and we'll flesh out obviously all those details in the implementation phase. And then in terms of the DORA, so as far as I know, DORA, you know, most of the signatories to DORA are academic institutions or institutions versus a national sort of sign up. And so I don't see DSI, for example, signing up to DORA, you know, as a national group. It's more about the groups, the organizations that have the researchers and and are measuring those researchers in terms of their impact and their outputs, as well as organizations like the National Research Foundation, who is also, you know, through their rating program, also measuring the outputs of researchers. So as long as those institutions and funding agencies sign up to DORA, and I think that's the most important, because they're the ones who are, you know, thinking about this. So DORA was only included not as a fundamental part of the policy. It was actually just included to recognize that this does exist, that people have that internationally, they've recognized that you shouldn't be looking at impact factor of journals. And so this is why, you know, we're not saying that DORA is an integral part of the policy and DSI must sign up to it. And then, yeah, so the incentives are in terms of the impact factors, it's not saying that you have to, you know, you can't publish it in high impact factor journals, and, you know, not all high impact factor journals are you know, are not open access, or closed access. But what it's saying is that when you recognize researchers that impact factor of the journal, and we're actually not allowed to report your impact factor of your journal in reports anymore for those organizations that have signed up to DORA. So it's just it was a side note in the policy to say that this exists, and it should be sort of recognized in terms of, you know, how we actually start measuring the outputs. And there was also a comment about the cost, and the cost of publishing in open access journals is extremely expensive. So many of the international funding organizations have actually signed up to Plan S. So this is the, you know, publish all your funded research has to be published in open access journals. And so many of these organizations actually allow you to put money in for open access publishing. I'm not sure we can expect DSI to cover everybody's open access publication, but you need to be able to put a line item, for example, in NRF grants, to be able to cover this. Otherwise, it's just the cost is not feasible for South African scientists. So we do recognize that as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. Perhaps if Eagle could take this one about plans for training in data stewardship and data science and open science. That's all. Or Adrian. Eagle, would you want to give this a bash first?
Sorry, Himna, I'm not sure which question that was.
It's a question by Louise Bezadenhout, and she'd like more information about the plans for training in data stewardship, data science, and open science. So
I think that I should. Can I bounce that to Adrian? Adrian, are you happy to take this one?
I'm happy. And I think what the policy does is it directs the department and its relevant institutions, subsidiaries or agencies to establish the appropriate training programs, you know, as part of the education and skills policy intent about ensuring that there's appropriate training for data stewards and curators and all of the other kind of skilled human capacity that is necessary to ensure the efficient and effective implementation and operation of an open science ecosystem in South Africa. Again, we haven't, whilst there's a body of literature and a huge background of documents that provide for and describe various research programs, well, should I say not research program, training programs that would encompass the scope of requirements needed, such as the ones that you've identified. We haven't necessarily gone into the planning stage. So there certainly aren't necessarily plans around the programs, but it's important and critical to ensure, as part of the guiding principle of ensuring we meet the principles of sustainability of the open science policy, that funding would ultimately be derive and come from the department. I don't speak on behalf of the department, but effectively, you know, through the establishment of the Centre, Citizen Science Centre, and other national forums, etc. You know, there's certain mechanisms and funded mechanisms that would have to be put into place. So I can't say much more than that, but Susan and Feltman would like to answer this question live. Oh, it's disappeared. Okay, right. I can also take the next one from Liesel. So the deposition and publication of publicly funded research outputs, and the risk you raise is right in respect of how to avoid duplication and data pollution. And I think it will be quite a slow process, but ultimately, you know, the intention is that there needs to be repositories, dedicated repositories, whether they be centralized in a single identified agency, or whether they are public entities that would be identified that would host that data. It really depends on where the data is being generated, where's the most appropriate place for it to be located, for example. But it ultimately is dedicated repositories, articles deposited in publishing houses, repositories, etc. It's important that when we're speaking about data, we're also talking about metadata. So, and ensuring that where there's no data, at least there's metadata, and the appropriate access is facilitated through the research data infrastructures is there, to try to reduce the duplication and data pollution. But I think that's part of the implementation plan, to ensure that we try to avoid that and mitigate that risk. But it's an important point to make. I think, Igor, you going, yeah. Go ahead, Igor.
Hibla, you are muted.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. A question further up the list.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, there is a question from Bongekile Skozana about publication in open access journals is very expensive, and this has been addressed a little bit, and funding oftentimes does not cover publication costs. This has been a deterrent on our part to publish in open access journals. I thoroughly agree with this. This is a major problem to be solved and entirely predictable. In the publishing world, if the cost barrier is removed for readers, it very often appears for publications in Nature are now at about $10,000. This is affordable for very, very few South Africans, and degrades the quality of our science in terms of the eyes of the rest of the world. We have to approach this very seriously with publishers, because it changes the way in which our science is seen. And I think that the quality of our science has been demonstrated very well during the pandemic. Himmler, the next one is by Joe Haverman. How will this policy be embedded in a Pan-African context? May I take that up?
Yeah, sure.
I think there's a major link here with the African Open Science Platform, and early sight of a couple of framework documents indicates to me that this is a very good way to go, because these policies are built on African Union policies and African Commission policies. So that link is absolutely critical there. Thank you, Himmler.
Thanks, Eagle. Adrian, I see you've indicated to take the next question on policy which is implemented.
Sure. And this is the role of the Open Science Observatory. The monitoring and evaluation framework needs to look holistically, not only at the policy implementation side, but also the impact and the outcomes of open science. So you can almost see it as covering, two phases of the implementation of open science. And so there's no monitoring and evaluation framework that has been developed, although we do have a whole host of various documents that look at a range of both quantitative and qualitative metrics as to how, looking both at the efficiency of the implementation of the open science system, as well as the outcomes and outputs of the research endeavor taking place within open science. And so the policy intends that the Open Science Advisory Board would approve a monitoring and evaluation framework to be implemented by the Open Science Observatory. And as part of that monitoring and evaluation framework, it's certainly the intention that it would cover the efficiencies and non-efficiencies, the strengths and weaknesses of the open science system in South Africa. So really monitor the open science system, as well as the impact of the research endeavor and enterprise taking place within open science.
Thanks. Adrian, there's another question below by Magodongo Mashlangu. Would you like to take that one?
Sure, and I think you're absolutely right. I think this is certainly a cultural change that we're going to have to interrogate. And in many cases, what we've done with the open science policy is what is critical is ensuring that as open as possible, as closed as necessary, is a fundamental guiding principle. And this really does encompass this and the mandatory implementation of open science. That mandatory is a really important footnote that I mentioned, but Igor actually went into quite some detail, that needs to recognize that there are other risks encountered by individual researchers and that impact their ability to participate within an open science system and open science framework. So the sharing of public funded research data, I mean, what is also critical is we've identified as one of the critical success factors for open science is ensuring trusted repositories from a security perspective. And so as part of the implementation plan for open science, remember there still needs to be the development of an implementation plan. As part of the implementation plan, that implementation plan needs to address each of those critical success factors. You can almost look at it as a risk register of some sort at an implementation level. And what are these issues that we need to be aware of and ensure that we can gain the confidence and are seen to be legitimate by the various stakeholders. And what is critical to that is ensuring appropriate secure repositories at an institutional level.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, cybercrime is something we all dread, but at any event, all of these things particularly when you have to curate and manage such large data sets that would eventually be in that open space, is definitely a consideration that a very, a team will have to be set aside to investigate. I mean, I suppose we already have certain systems in place in other applications of cybercrime. So the intelligence does exist. All we need to do is to apply it in the context of protection for the open science systems.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were gonna.
Sorry, I also I'd read two questions and I'd answered both questions in one. So there's a latter question by an anonymous person who indicates that not all science lends itself to open science. And I think this is really looking at, is the intention that public funding will be focused only on open science to support this endeavor? And I think this is where the issue of looking at mandatory and what constitutes mandatory, what are the caveats associated with mandatory participation within an open science policy, but also recognizing that there are discipline-specific risks that arise simply by the way in which the research enterprise and research community operates and works. And so all of those things need to be and are taken into account, and should not, the implementation of the open science system should not prejudice the individual researcher undertaking good quality, excellent science. So I think that is a critical point that's made within the policy, and hopefully does address that concern.
Thank you. Does anybody want to tackle Safia Mohammed's question? What is the policy stance on data stewardship, and will the policy provide examples of practical benefit sharing mechanisms?
I can try and tackle that. And certainly the policy has a very strong position on data stewardship and data curation. That is part of the policy intent in respect of open data, and this is a kind of a critical to ensure that data is both accessible, shareable, and the barriers to entry to that data is reduced as far as possible. The policy doesn't necessarily provide examples, but I think off the top of my head, practical benefit sharing mechanisms. At a first instance, coming from South African Radio Astronomy Observatory, we are on an ongoing basis make all of our data open and is shared globally after a certain proprietary period. So, for example, if you're a lead researcher or principal investigator for a project proposal utilizing our research platforms, you have proprietary period for 1 or 2 years, after which to do your science, or after which that data becomes publicly available. There's quite a recent and well-known image that has been produced in the last couple of weeks that has appeared on various news sites. That data was actually taken, the collection of that data, scientific data, was actually first collected in 2018. And it's taken 3 years to be able to process that data. So even though that data is a first scientific result, there's a substantial amount of underlying science that still needs to be exploited from that original data. And it also speaks to those questions around reusing of data. I think this is a very good practical example where we say, we effectively making all of this data now available for the global community, because actually there's so much data that we, as a South African research community, we'd spend many years trying to just process that initial amount of huge data sets that have risen. So I suspect that there'll be a huge amount of science being produced from that data sets. And it's important for us to be able to make it as globally accessible as possible. And stewardship and curation of that data is a critical part of that to ensure that it's accessible. The more we make it accessible, and not just technically, the more from an infrastructure perspective, but also from a accessibility tools perspective. The more we make it accessible, the more science outcomes will be produced from that same data set. So I think that's really important. And I think whilst the policy doesn't go into the details of that, I think it again provides an enabling framework, and we also require that the USAf needs to be seen as a legitimate and a trusted party in steering us through the implementation of open science and development and establishment of the open science ecosystem in South Africa.
So there are a couple of questions related to support and costs. And so one is, how can the National Coordinating Office ensure that service providers at tertiary institutions are sufficiently supported? Another question pertains to, are there estimates of the costs and potential cost savings for implementation of various models of an open science policy? And the last one is in that kind of theme, how does institutions like ASSAf and USAf and other organizations plan to remedy the issues on this framework? I presume it's on the framework. So any ideas about the support at tertiary and the costs or savings for the various models of an open science policy?
I can have a little go at that. So we haven't, I think it's hard to quantify costs, because so the cost savings in, from the funder's point of view. So if you fund, expensive data collection, and that data can be reused, then actually the value of that data increases, and you get your money back several times. But again, that's hard to quantify, at a particular, it's not going to impact a particular researcher. So there are downstream savings and costs because you don't have to regenerate data. You can answer many questions of the data and potentially lead to innovations. But in terms of the cost, there is definitely a cost to open science. There's a cost to resources required to curate data, to have it put into repositories, to have those repositories developed in the first place. So to build the infrastructure, there is a cost associated. So we haven't actually quantified that. And obviously that'll come down to the implementation and, what is in place, looking at what is in place already and what can be built on that exists versus what needs to be, developed from scratch. So I think that the costing is a big issue, and you need to say who's going to have to deal with that cost. Is it going to be, the DSI? Is it going to be ASSAf? Is it going to be individual institutions, or is it going to be individual researchers on their grants? So that needs to be thrashed out in a lot of details. I see Igor and Prof. Bauer both have their hands up, so maybe they have some, and Adrian. So I'm sure they have some useful insights too.
Thank you. We'll go in that order: Igor, Ahmed, and then Adrian. Igor? Igor, unmute, please.
Thank you. The connection's a little unstable. In terms of costs, it has to be fundamental, sustainable. For example, Professor Patricia Whitelock points out that the cost of storing all the data being obtained and making it accessible in a fair way might get funding that is going to science in this country. That is absolutely true. That is why one has to observe this very carefully to see what the effect is and change the policy if necessary, because we can't go up in science if we can't do any science. So the costs are absolutely critical. That National Information Center consortium, information consortium, has some good data on this and on possible transitions. And it's really very clear that the transition has to be very, very indeed. Get funding for publication. then we will certainly in the country. Thanks, Henry.
Thanks, Igor. Ahmed, over to you.
Thank you so much, Himla. And, yeah, I just want to say that, I think it'll be a mistake for us to imagine that, that we're going to build an open science platform on existing systems. For example, can we continue as a scientific community, as a global scientific community, to tolerate the hegemony of a few big publishing houses of scientific journals? Surely it's time, for the global science system to take back the ownership of publishing, because that's where it originally started, and that's where it should reside. So I think the point I'm making is that we should really think of open science as also being the impetus for developing new new approaches, if you like, to publishing, to data warehousing, and so on. So it is about saying that this is also a transformation, if you like, of the scientific enterprise around the world. I could just say, for example, that the International Science Council has a project at the moment on what it calls the opening the record of science. That's what it calls it, and is really calling for kind of new systems of science publishing, for example, which are completely outside of the models that are currently dominant, if you like. But we can think about that, of course, in all the different aspects, if you like, including the governance of science. So, I see this, Pradesh, for example, has raised the issue of not the issue, but raised the idea of the Center of Citizen Science building relationships with statutory and non-statutory structures. That will be a transformation of a governance model, So it seems to me, at least, that we have to think of open science as providing the basis for the creation of new approaches to the scientific enterprise. Thanks.
Thanks, Ahmed. And the document does talk about, the changing mindset as you forge ahead with thinking on open science. I think those sections in the document need to be read so that we kind of have a paradigm shift first in our minds, acknowledging that, as you say, Ahmed, that we should think of this as a new scientific enterprise in terms of the future, the future way of thinking. We heard about issues related to the new work model of the hybrid model, work from home. How do you facilitate all of this happening with the backdrop of a world that's moving forward, but at the same time with certain challenges that we've experienced that we've mitigated against? And how then do we embrace and encompass other changes, particularly something as vast as rethinking a world based on open science, open access, open data. So yeah, it is going to be a changing mindset. There are a whole lot of questions of varying kind of ideas built around this thinking. But before I get ahead of myself, let me allow Adrian to
just before
respond.
Adrian comes in, Adrian,
Yeah.
if you don't mind, I just want to make one more point, and that is that one of the things that is completely clear to me is that we have to move towards kind of a national approach, to these big issues instead of an institutional approach. So now I'm not suggesting that institutions are not autonomous and all of that. That's clearly, a part of our system. That it would be a dangerous thing, to kind of just simply strip away autonomy and so on. But for example, the issue around scientific publishing and access to journals, we have to adopt a national approach rather than an institutional approach to those kinds of things. In other words, saying, can we begin to aggregate resources which will allow us to be much more effective and efficient in access and in access to it. I'm just using that as one example, but you can imagine that in across the board in terms of data warehousing and everything else. Sorry, Adrian, I shouldn't have stopped.
I mean, my comment will probably just be quite short, but in terms of trying to quantify the cost of open science and implementing open science, I guess, you know, one should maybe ask the question, what is the cost of not implementing it? And it certainly is quantified in the various studies that have been undertaken within the EU, remembering that the ASSAf dialogue framework informed a lot of, you know, provided a lot of inputs into the development of this policy, but certainly the opportunity cost of not having a fair research data, for example, in the EU in 2019 was something of the order of 10.2 billion euros annually. Now, don't ask me how that cost was ultimately determined or developed, but it does point to you that there's the you know, potentially significant cost savings, but also I think more important, as part of the conversation, one also needs to look at the value, right? We need to talk about cost because that's critical in terms of the successful implementation of open science, but we also need to look at the value of open science and the potential downstream value of establishing an open science within South Africa, both looking at the research enterprise and as well as the direct and indirect socioeconomic benefits that arise. So you know, I'm always kind of uncomfortable when we only talk about costs when we're trying to make this trade-off. We also need to understand it's about the value of implementing open science within South Africa. One of the things, and we did recognize, I mean, the point made by Patricia is really important, that, you know, the cost of just doing data curation, stewardship of all of the data that's produced from publicly funded research in South Africa is substantial. And we did recognize this in including a descriptor around valuable publicly funded research outputs. And the intention was that that descriptor of valuable would be defined based on what is actually possible in terms of the fiscal environment. What can be realistically done? Because what we don't want to do is have a policy that just can't be implemented because of financial constraints. So you need to provide a lever, and that's one of the levers which we had intended to enable an implementation plan that can be developed and grown and established and enhanced over time. And there may be other opportunities within the policy, and it's a useful point just to look at the policy again through that kind of perspective to ensure that there's the appropriate levers are in place within the policy that take cognizance of the financial constraints that may or may not be imposed, because ultimately you can't implement one provision or policy intent without the other. We need to be able to do all of the policy intents at the same time, but the degree to which they're implemented may be determined and dictated by any kind of funding constraint. That's ultimately part of the implementation plan.
Thanks. Denise, I'm not sure your question, what does ASSAf, USAf and other organizations plan to do to remedy the above issues? I'm not sure which issues. We've discussed so many at the moment, so I'm going to park this one unless you give me some clarity. But from a perspective of ASSAf, I can say that ASSAf strongly supports open science and open access, etc. And we will continue to work with the DSI to ensure that when this framework is developed, that we engage with the academic and scientific community to bring them up to speed on terms of what the framework is all about. And also, I'm sure USAf will do the same at the institutional level. So I'm not going to provide a specific answer because I'm not sure what that question actually pertains to. Sepotil asks about questions, sections in the policy for the funding model for students for publication costs across the various disciplines and fields. I'm sure that when the models are being proposed, that some needs will be given to students, and also with respect to issues related to equity, the document does speak to enabling researchers at former HDI, historically disadvantaged institutions, support for women, etc. So I'm sure the policy will be sensitive to the needs of advancing interests of young scholars, particularly the early career people, to promote them to be able to publish in these spheres. We've already had a major discussion about costs and how we should work together to try to contribute to aggregate resources. So unless there's anybody who specifically wants to add anything to Seppo's question, I will like to move on. But think about it, I'm sure there are many, many more in the 47 questions as I scroll down that will be linked to something similar to that. Pradesh Ramprasad talks about citizen science and says that the center needs to build relations with statutory and non-statutory professional bodies to ensure greater participation of professionals in the field, and also to incorporate those scientists that are not trained as academic researchers, but work in industry or teaching and can make a contribution to the overall knowledge in science in South Africa. So that was more of a comment. Ames Dye asks a very interesting question, and this is not related to cyber security, but with dual use research being a reality, would there be adequate safeguards to manage this risk? Who would like to take this one? The dual risk that every so often there are people who find opportunities to misuse data originally intended for the betterment of utility. Nikki, let's touch. Okay, Eagle's put a hand up. Eagle?
I think that the misuse of data is a danger, and we haven't seen it very much yet because it's relatively new. We have seen the misuse of scientific publications, as for example with the ivermectin study in the pandemic. I think this is a question for science altogether, and this needs to be discussed by scientific organizations. The academies needs thorough discussion within DSI and SASTA, the communications agency. And it's really time for that discussion because it's a communication concern. We are going to face misuse, and I don't think the scientific community here or worldwide really knows what to do about it. Thanks, Henry.
Yeah, thanks, Eagle. On that issue, ASSAf did host a webinar towards the end of last year on dual research with quite an international panel of speakers. And I'm sure that that is still available on the ASSAf website or on Facebook for those people who would like to follow it on the ASSAf site, of course. Let's see now. Concerning the national forum that shall be established, when might we expect this to be established, and who or which entity would you envisage managing this platform? I think let's leave that question for the way forward that Segrin will speak to at the end. So Janine, if you could just wait, and Segrin, if you could note that question by Janine van Rensburg to take in your closing statements for the way forward. Madhu says that the vision statement, where's this, does not articulate the future desired state, and there is no mission statement. Without a clear vision and mission statement, grassroots science and innovation would be lost. Any comments?
I think I mean, we can note that and reinterrogate the vision statement with the OSAB and colleagues. But you know, I'm happy for you to have raised that issue. So we'll just note it.
Thank you. Patricia Whitlock says, I fear that the cost of storing all the data being obtained in South Africa and making it accessible in the fair way, as fair defined in the guiding principles, to anyone who might be interested, is going to take vastly more funding than is currently going into science in this country. Any comments? I see you nod.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I tried to answer this earlier, in that absolutely correct, and not just storing it, but even substantially more costs associated with curating it, because you need to curate it to be able to realize the value and actually really make it accessible. Because I can store data quite easily, and ultimately it becomes inaccessible other than to those that generated the data, because they know what the data looks like and where it is. So you really have to curate it. And again, this points to the utilization of that descriptor of valuable. And I think to begin with, it's going to be very important to really understand, and I think this is part of the critical success factors of described in the policy, is to actually run the cost models and to understand what will it cost to be able to curate what constitutes valuable publicly funded research outputs. And we need to identify what we mean by valuable. And I think to begin with, it will probably it will result in quite a limited scope of research data that will be stored and curated. And that would have to grow. It would have to, so we see it's not one big bang approach. We're going to have to extend that over time as the funding becomes more available. But also what will make it easier, I think, is as the research data management plans become mandatory as part of grant submissions, to explaining how, so the research outputs would effectively be ready-made for implementation into a fair framework. That is certainly going to be able to make things a lot easier. And so I think we'll see the growth of that, the data that is stored and curated within a fair framework as quite rapid, hopefully. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was just going, yeah, because it does speak to one of the other questions that was posed by Samuel in the legitimate grounds for not making things open as possible, as close as necessary. And that's where the data management plans are really quite critical, because it's important for researchers, if they identify any possible restrictions or risks that would stop them from making the research outputs open, they need to be able to justify that as part of the data management plans, which would have to form part of any kind of funding application or submission. So there would be a process as to what the objective metrics are. I mean, there's a description as was noted in the policy, but ultimately it would need to be determined by the relevant funding agencies that are approving or denying any kind of grant applications. Sorry, Nicola.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to add about the data storage. So in my field, there are so many public databases that are maintained by really well-funded institutions overseas, and there's the new Global Biodata Coalition, which is actually going to fund many of those. So where we don't need or don't want to store our data, we can actually submit raw files to them, and we know it's absolutely secure. And so we try to only store the stuff, the components, the process data that we want to actually work with. And I think in terms of data that does need to be think about long-term storage, we need to think about what parts of that data, so you don't have to store every piece of that processing along the line, what data can be reproduced very quickly versus what data will actually cost you more to reproduce. And you only store the data that maybe perhaps it's the raw data, and it's going to be different for different fields. So that also requires careful thinking about what components of the data do need to be stored long-term versus storing everything, and also the national importance of the data. So I think there are many things that need to be thought about in terms of data storage, and this will also impact the costs. And there are obviously a lot of compression algorithms coming along, for archiving of data that'll reduce the size as well. So this is an evolving area, and I think we need to think about what absolutely needs to be stored versus what can be regenerated at a minimal cost.
think that's very important to contextualize what is available and what some of the needs are and what resources exist globally for us in South Africa to patch into. So Adrian, I just want to check whether your comments to Samuel was based on the question that is next on the fair data principles. So you've tackled that one, right?
Yeah, the kind of justifications around restriction, and that needs to form part of the data management plans as to why you're making, why does a researcher, how does a researcher justify not to make their research output open?
So there's another question by an anonymous attendee, and that relates to what you call it, let me see, open access. Does open access necessarily mean making research outputs available immediately, that is on publication and without embargoes? I think when you talked about the SKA, you did say that you'll make things available provided there's a period. So you just want to clarify that comment?
Yeah, and this is probably also Eagle's Eagle's thought a lot by this, but certainly in respect of SK and Meerkat, and this is typical within certainly the radio astronomy community, that there's typically a proprietary period that a principal investigator can undertake their research on collected data. But once that proprietary period is over, it becomes freely accessible. And that proprietary period is typically 12 to 24 months. So even in the case of the most recent, science outputs, the proprietary period lapsed before we were able to have published the scientific results. So I think we'll be very much field specific, but I don't know, maybe Eagle open access, this I guess this also looks at other aspects. So I'm not sure you've got anything to add.
Yep, if I can share a screen, perhaps. Can you see my screen, Adrian?
Yep.
Okay, so limitations in gold access should be online immediately, but there are variations in which it has an period. There was also a question about preprints. These are peer-reviewed types of publication, including gold open access and green open access. Preprints fall outside peer review and are used very considerably in nuclear physics and or particle physics and in astronomy, and are extremely valuable. And are they open to predatory practices? I think there are a great deal of preprints out there that are complete nonsense. So yes, if they're taken up by non-scientists, there is a problem there. There is also the vanity press over here. This is an interesting one that is both free for readers and peer-reviewed through subsidy publishers. America is an organization starting in South America that goes very much towards free for readers and free for authors, getting up towards diamond open access over here. But where does the money come from? In South America, it comes from the government. I'm not sure if this is a good model for South Africa. Over to you, Adrian.
Oh, we missed the last 5 seconds of you because you were on mute.
Sorry, over to you. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to scroll down a little bit because we have another 46 questions and like 3 minutes. left. So I'm sorry that it is not possible for us to get through to everything, but there is one person I would like to introduce to those of you who are still online, and that is Dr. Shyamo Motshekwa, who's just been appointed as the director of the Africa Open Science Platform. So I want to welcome him into this new role, and I'm sure that we are going to work closely with him and the deputy Knox, whom I've had the privilege of meeting recently. And Shyama's comment was again about the engagement with industry as a stakeholder. We did acknowledge that through Eagle's response that we haven't really done that, and that is an area that we should be exploring. So Shyama, the point has been noted and taken care of. There are a couple questions related to, let me see, publishing companies, and I want to take the one by Siba Balwe, who's speaking on behalf of the Scholarly Publishing Committee of the Publishers Association of South Africa, or PASA. And what is the question here? When is engagement with stakeholders expected to happen before formulation of the next draft of the Code of Conduct? Does anyone want to attempt this one?
Yes, this is the engagement. It helped to come to stakeholders without a draft for comment. And so this is the time to interact. I think both PASA and the Scholarly Publishing Platform, the National Scholarly Editors Forum, and the editors of books and journals should engage from now, and that's the purpose of this meeting. And onwards, comment coming in, especially if it makes a suggestion as to what could reasonably be done going forward. I think also in terms of the engagement with journals going forward, that is really in the bounds of recovery and management consortium. The advisory board itself. Thanks.
So this is part of the inequity, bandwidth, accessibility across institutions. So before we talk about all these big science, big data, etc., these are the realities that we live with in the country, that not all institutions have equal access to bandwidths to be able to access these resources. So something needs to be done to address that in a significant sort of way. Ahmed, I would like to pose Prof. Stephanie Burton's question concerning what are we making, or what is the progress in working with publishing companies regarding the transition to open access publishing? Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Stephanie, for that as well. I think that we're at the point, we had a workshop with the vice chancellors at the end of last year, at least December, just to kind of really get them to begin to engage with the, with the idea of building a national approach to scientific publishing, in particular to accessing scientific publishing, and to making it open access and so on. And there was broad agreement amongst the vice chancellors, at least, that we should move in this direction. The challenge at the moment is that, we're very much sort of held to ransom, if you like, by the big publishers. I mean, simply because, we spend about 600 million rand a year on subscription fees to 5 of the big publishers. And basically, if we are going to sort of enter into tight negotiations with them, a part of our commitment will have to be to kind of say to the publishers, if you don't agree with us, we're going to stop stop accessing your materials, like, which requires a lot of what's the word, sort of consensus building, if you like, amongst the universities and other scientific organizations and so on. So that's something that's still very much on the cards. SANLIC is now, in fact, beginning to negotiate what is called these transformative agreements, but we're not yet at the point where we can adopt a national approach, if you like. I mean, I think that's still going to take some time for us to achieve.
Thanks, Ahmed. It's always best to get an answer straight from the person who knows the best. Dr. Paladi says that I am worried that we may be giving a greater emphasis on the open data whilst neglecting other critical components of that ecosystem. Thanks, the presenters. Dr. Paladi, what I would suggest is that if you have comments or something to add where the drafters could take into consideration some of your ideas, please get in touch with either Adrian or Chandeka at the DSI, and she could forward that to the draft, to the experts for incorporation. While they have done a great job, I'm sure there are other things that could be omitted. So and this is an open suggestion to people on this this webinar, that should you have issues that have not been addressed, please address that through the DSI office, so that we could forward it appropriately to the people concerned. Similarly, Moyo asks if there would be further engagement with stakeholders. We'll see what Segrin has to say at the end of that session. Chair, there are another 45 questions in the chat. We've gone through about 40 of them already, and I'm afraid in the interest of time, I cannot take anything, but I would just quickly ask the three presenters to scroll through any of the questions that are burning issues that you would like to address before I bring this session to a close. One of the difficulties in trying to chair a session and keep tabs of things and listen to what's going on is that I don't have the insight of advancement. So, Adrian, anything from your side?
Yeah, I was just going to, I mean, without, there's some really good questions here that either provide suggestions or recommendations explicitly, but also because the question is being raised, it may mean that there's certain gaps in our policy, and we've tried to address it, and obviously is not addressed appropriately. So I hope that we can get a copy of all of the questions that have been asked, and then we can interrogate them, and then hopefully, and we can even potentially make contact with the individuals for follow-up in terms of clarifying what they meant by their question, etc., to see how we can address it. So I certainly welcome that.
Thank you very much. Eagle, any last-minute comments from your side?
There is a request for further I'd like to bounce that to Professor Bawa for consideration by the Open Science Advisory Board. I also think there should be one point for incoming comments, advice, helpful concerns, and so on. And I wonder if such a single point could be made. I'm in the mountains at the moment and will miss emails for some time to come. So could we perhaps appoint someone to receive such comments and sort them out? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great thing. And again, I'll leave that for Segrin in his discussion on the way forward. Nikki, any last minute comments from yourself?
Just to thank everybody for the valuable input and the questions. I have, Adrian, copied all the questions into a document so that we can do individual follow-up and see where we need to make changes to the document. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, Renata will do the same from ASSAf. Chair, I am sorry that I haven't been able to go through all the questions, and I am particularly impressed by the people attending to have taken the time to articulate their questions and comments to the panel. It is very encouraging that people have given deep consideration to this very vital issue on the cards for us through the DSI for the benefit of the country. So with your permission, Chair, I'd like to bring this session to a close, noting that we will take a copy of all the questions. And as Adrian has said, they will address it, and perhaps at the end of this, we will submit a kind of synthetic summation of the proceedings, and hopefully we would have had an opportunity to address everything going on. So with that, I hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Hila, and thank you to Adrian, Eagle, and Nicola. I think that it's been a really rich discussion, and especially say thank you to the participants. I think who really sort of engaged with the issues, and clearly there's still a sort of major, it's still going to be a major challenge, I think, to get this to work. And I suspect that one of the biggest challenges we are going to face is this idea of sort of policy consonance. Getting all the different policy sort of instruments that we have in our system to work together, if you like, to produce something that builds momentum, if you like, and that's something I think that we'll have to pay attention to as we head into the future. Yeah, so I'm really now going to call on Segun, Dr. Segun Woodley, who's Director of Basic Sciences in the Department of Science and Innovation, who's been really kind of central to this enterprise. And ask him, please, Segun, to kind of point us in the way forward. I mean, I think we all have an idea of where we're heading towards, but I think it's also about just the process issues, it seems to me. I should just add, that there's a whole range of discussions lined up. I mean, I know that the Deputy Vice Chancellor's Research, for example, are planning an engagement with the DSI on open science, and the RISG, the Research Innovation Strategy Group at USAf, is planning an engagement and so on. So I think there's a whole range of consultations still to come, but it will be useful, I think, for you to lay out just how, what the next DSI kind of approach is going to be with regard to open science. Thanks.
Thanks, Amit. Perhaps just to start off by saying that the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation's National Policy Development Framework was used as a guide to draft the South African Open Science Policy. And we are very cognizant of embedding the DPME's socioeconomic impact assessment system in the policy-making process. And I think it should be clear from the presentations by Igor, Adrian, and Nicola that we adhered very strongly to the following guiding principles for the open science policy development process: that open science should evolve in ways that are inclusive of geography, gender, institution, ethnicity, and financial standing. It should respect the motivations of different stakeholders as much as possible, whilst adhering to essential priorities, but it should also be promoted as an enabling process of benefit to all stakeholders. So the writing team then, in consultation with the Department of Science and Innovation and the Open Science Advisory Board, will reflect on the feedback from the Stakeholder Workshop. We will consolidate and synthesize the inputs, and then revise the draft open science policy accordingly. The revised open science policy will be tabled at a Department of Science and Innovation EXCO meeting in mid to late March 2022 for endorsement and for approval of the next steps in the policy formulation process. Just to give you a sense of timelines, the minimal period taken for evidence-based policy to be developed and approved by Cabinet usually takes between 12 and 18 months. So the sequence of steps that we would need to follow is that the DSI EXCO approved draft South African open science policy will have to be subject to DPME's socioeconomic impact assessment system. The SIAS basically refers to the ex-ante policy analysis tool for assessing impacts and likely costs and the benefits of the proposed public policy. This will then be followed by targeted stakeholder engagements, which will continue because in this process, we see stakeholder involvement as a mutual learning process, a co-creation process, rather than a once-off linear process. So there will be stakeholders that are attending the session that we might still engage post this as well to work on specific policy intents and recommendations as well. Once we've gone through that process, we will then need to seek approval of the draft open science policy by the Minister of Higher Education, Science and Innovation. And once we get approval from the Minister, we'll then be able to table this open science policy at the economic sectors and employment cluster. And once it passes through that cluster, we will have to prepare a Cabinet memorandum, briefing notes, and the DPME SIAS report that I alluded to earlier, will then go to Cabinet committees and to Cabinet. In other words, we're talking here about the policy authorization structures for approval. So once that's done, the next stage will then be for the draft policy to be gazetted for public comments. So again, another round of stakeholder inputs. And once those inputs have been received and the policy adapted and amended in line with those inputs, Cabinet, it will then be submitted to Cabinet formally for approval, for implementation, and then finally you get promulgation of the policy for implementation. Now this stakeholder engagement workshop, I think Prof. Bauer and Prof. Himmler and others would also agree with me, has been very valuable since it has served various purposes. It was also informative, I think, for us as both DSI and as well as the Open Science Advisory Board and the policy writers as well. It has allowed us to promote, test, and consult on the open science policy proposals. Stakeholder involvement is particularly important for open science policy, especially since what we've heard is that open science is meant to make science more transparent, collaborative, and reproducible, with a view to creating a more inclusive, transformed, coherent, and responsive national science system. So the idea around open science commons or platforms, particularly those that work at disciplinary or topic level, they have proven to be very powerful stimulators of behavior internationally. They tend to bring very strong benefits to participants and clearly illustrate the value of open science processes. So the essential lesson that I think we have learned is that open science flourishes when it is adopted as a demonstrably beneficial norm of behavior by practicing scientists. But this notwithstanding, the specifics around some of the recommendations that Adrian and others mentioned, such as the Open Science Observatory, the National Forum, now these will be articulated in the implementation plan, which will be developed after the open science policy has been approved by Cabinet. This is the usual protocol that we follow in government. Policy is first approved, then an implementation plan is developed. It is important to bear in mind, though, that an open science policy sets out the broad vision, the rationale, and expression of the values inherent in open science, and it makes the case for the transition to open science while a roadmap or an implementation plan will provide the specific details relating to the who, the what, the when, and the how. So similar to the open science policy development process, the drafting of the implementation plan will involve multi-stakeholder involvement and will also follow a co-creation process. So since this policy co-creation is an important principle then of DSI's policy development process, I would like to encourage stakeholders who still want to submit written inputs to the DSI to do so via Ms. Thandeka Hallis by Friday, 25th February, and I'm sure Thandeka will then post her email on the chat. And just as a sort of a last point that I wanted to make, even though, you know, the aspiration of open data, open access, citizen science, and more broadly, open science and open innovation, we have articulated that in the DSI's white paper on science, technology, and innovation, which was approved by Cabinet in 2019, as well as in the DSI's decadal plan. But even though these principles are hardwired in the white paper and the decadal plan, there is still a need for a standalone, bespoke, open science policy for South Africa, because it is necessary, to guide and direct the actions of role players in open science, such as your funders, your publishers, your learned societies, higher education institutions, science councils, private sector, libraries, researchers, and citizens and NGOs as well. It's important to clarify, the roles and responsibilities in the open science landscape, ensure that we have consistency in the actions of persons and institutions expected to implement the policy. We need to facilitate uniformity in the applications of rules and decision-making, clarify the meanings of terms, improve the accountability of role players, and finally also to reduce duplication of effort and prevent unnecessary conflict amongst different actors in the open science space. Okay, with that, Prof. Bawa, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Segun. And I think all that remains for me to do is to ask, first of all, to ask Dr. Adams if there's anything he'd like to add at this point.
No, Chair. Just to say thank you very much again to the expert task team for a job well done in getting us to this point, and you as a chair, and to Himla. And a big thank you to all the participants in this workshop, and especially the constructive contributions that they made. So, facilitating this with the help of ASSAf. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then finally, just to again just reiterate our thanks to the expert task team, to members of the advisory board, and then of course to Himla and her team at ASSAf, and of course the DSI team for really getting us to the point where we can have these conversations. And so clearly this is going to be still a lot of work to be done, and a lot of sort of imagination and so on. And I think that we have to constantly think of this as an opportunity for change. I mean that this is an opportunity for sort of realigning our science system, bringing it to more effect, if you like, to address the grand challenges facing our society. So, with that, let me just say thank you to the participants, because without you, we wouldn't have had this very rich conversation today. And to thank you all very much for spending this time with us. With that, I'm going to bring this meeting to a close. Thank you so much, everybody.